There's a moment in everyone's life when everything changes, when the people you trust the most suddenly turn their backs on you. For Scott, that moment came when his son, Jack, placed him in a nursing home without a second thought. After a lifetime of sacrifice, after everything Scott had done for his family, he was left alone to face the end of his days in a place that made him feel like he was forgotten. But instead of surrendering to loneliness, Scott made a decision that would change everything. He could have sat idly, letting the world pass him by, but that wasn't who he was. His hands, once calloused from years of hard work, had more stories to tell, and he wasn't about to let his story fade into the background. Scott began to write, not just about the memories of his life, but about the lessons he'd learned, about love, hardship, resilience, and strength. The book he wrote became a sensation, a testament to the power of perseverance. Scott went from being the forgotten father to a best-selling author and sought-after speaker. His words, filled with wisdom and raw emotion, began to resonate with thousands, maybe millions, who saw in him their own struggles and triumphs. But what happened next shocked Jack. He thought his father was weak, fragile, past his prime. But what he didn't realize was that Scott wasn't just writing a book. He was writing a legacy. A legacy that would not only leave an impact on the world, but change the way his son saw him forever. Scott had no idea how much he still had to give. But when Jack returned to see what had become of his father, he was about to learn one powerful lesson. Never underestimate someone, especially when they've been forgotten. Scott had always been the kind of man who gave everything for his family. Born and raised in a modest home in a small town, he knew what it meant to struggle. His early years were defined by hard work, sacrifice, and a constant desire to make life better for his loved ones. His father, a carpenter, taught him how to use his hands, how to build and repair things, how to work until the job was done, no matter the cost. Scott inherited his father's work ethic, and from the moment he became a father himself, he knew that he would never stop giving. He would work long hours, come home covered in dirt, and still find time to care for his son, Jack. Jack was Scott's pride and joy. From the moment he held him in his arms for the first time, Scott had been determined to provide the best for his son. He worked his fingers to the bone to make sure Jack never went without, even if it meant sacrificing his own needs. As Jack grew up, Scott encouraged him to chase his dreams, to aim for something greater than the life he had known. It wasn't just about financial success. Scott wanted Jack to experience a world full of possibilities, to never have to feel the sting of going without. He pushed Jack to do well in school, to take opportunities when they came, and to never give up. But somewhere along the way, Scott began to feel like his efforts were being taken for granted. Jack had grown up into a successful young man. He had a job in the city, a busy social life, and an ever-expanding circle of friends. As much as Scott had tried to keep up with the changes in his son's life, he began to feel more like an afterthought than a priority. Scott didn't mind the quiet moments, the times when it was just him working on small projects around the house or in the garage. He enjoyed the peace of his own company, the comfort of the familiar. He had spent his life building things, first his home, then his family, and now he took pride in those things, cherishing the memories they held. He had spent countless hours fixing up his garden, trimming the hedges and planting flowers, all with the hope that Jack would come around one day to appreciate it. But as the years passed, the visits from Jack became fewer and fewer. What was once a family-oriented home now felt silent and empty, save for Scott's own presence. In his heart, Scott knew something was wrong, but he tried to ignore it. He had always been a man of action, someone who didn't dwell on things he couldn't change. He would continue to work, continue to care for his garden, continue to live his life. But the isolation began to eat at him. He would watch as neighbors and friends went about their days, spending time with their families, while he was left to fend for himself. When Jack finally visited one fateful afternoon to inform Scott that he had made arrangements for him to be placed in a nursing home, it felt like the final blow. Jack's words were firm, almost clinical, as he explained that he was too busy with his own life to care for Scott anymore. The decision had been made. Scott had always prided himself on being independent, on being self-sufficient, but now he felt like a burden. The man who had once been the pillar of his family, the one who had worked tirelessly to ensure their happiness, was now being abandoned, left to a facility where his son wouldn't have to see the reality of old age. There was a time when I thought family meant everything. I dedicated my life to my son, Greg. Every sacrifice, every decision I made, it was all for him. But in the blink of an eye, that love was rejected. My son, the one I raised, the one I spent my entire life building a future for, looked me in the eyes and told me he didn't need me anymore. It wasn't just words. Those words hit me like a punch to the gut, leaving me breathless and stunned. How could the person I had given everything to, the person I thought would always have my back, turn on me so coldly? At that moment, I realized something profound. Sometimes, the people we love the most can hurt us the deepest. But here's the twist. Sometimes, it's those very moments that make us stronger than we ever thought possible. I could have begged him, pleaded with him to reconsider, but I didn't. Instead, I made a decision that would change everything. I packed up my life, left everything behind, and began again. No help from anyone, not even my own son. The world may have expected me to crumble, but I didn't. I rebuilt myself, created something out of nothing, and learned a life-changing lesson in the process. And when Greg came back, asking for help, he was in for a surprise, because I wasn't the man he thought I was. What had next left him speechless, and in the end, he learned something he would never forget. This is a story of strength, sacrifice, and a lesson that no one should take the love of family for granted. Brandon had always been the kind of man who believed in hard work, commitment, and sacrifice. His life wasn't easy. Nothing about it ever had been, but it was one that he had built with his own hands. Raised in a modest home, he never had much, but his parents instilled in him a powerful sense of responsibility. From an early age, he understood that life wasn't about what you had, but what you gave. His father, a factory worker who came home every night with sore hands and a tired back, was his role model. He worked long hours, never complained, and always made sure his family had enough to survive. Brandon had learned that love wasn't always about words. It was about action. He carried this lesson with him through life, especially when he became a father himself. When Greg was born, Brandon saw it as his duty to provide the best life he could. He didn't just want to give his son the material things he never had. He wanted to teach him the values that had guided him: discipline, respect, and the importance of family. Every day, Brandon would rise before dawn and work tirelessly at the factory, putting in overtime whenever he could. He never took a day off unless absolutely necessary. His work wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. It allowed him to put food on the table and give Greg everything he needed. As Greg grew older, Brandon's sacrifices continued. He wasn't the type to lavish his son with expensive toys or take extravagant vacations. Instead, he spent his time teaching Greg how to fix things around the house, showing him how to work with his hands. Brandon believed in the value of a strong work ethic, and he made sure Greg understood that. They spent hours together in the garage, where Brandon taught him how to change oil, fix a flat tire, and handle basic repairs. He would always tell Greg, "It's not about what you have, son, but what you can do with what you've got." But as the years went by, something changed. Greg started to grow distant. It wasn't sudden. It was gradual, like the slow fade of a sunset. At first, it was small things. He no longer wanted to spend time with his father in the garage. He was too busy with his friends, his school, and his own interests. Brandon didn't mind at first. After all, Greg was growing up, becoming his own person. But over time, the distance between them widened. Greg no longer asked for his father's advice or wanted to share his life with him. Brandon's heart ached as he saw his son drift away, but he didn't push him. He knew that was part of life, that children grow up, find their own paths, and start to form their own identities. Brandon tried not to take it personally, but it was hard. Every father wants to feel needed, to know that their love and sacrifices are appreciated. But with Greg, it felt like the more Brandon gave, the less he received. It was as if Greg was becoming more and more independent, until one day, Brandon realized he had become irrelevant in his son's life. It was a bitter pill to swallow. For days, Scott sat in the sterile room of the nursing home, the silence of the place pressing down on him. The walls were white and impersonal, the air thick with the scent of antiseptic. There was no warmth here, no comfort. His only company were the other residents, many of whom had stories of their own, stories of family, of loss, of faded memories. He had become just another face in the crowd, a nameless figure whose past achievements seemed insignificant in the face of his current reality. But Scott was no stranger to hardship. He had weathered storms before, and he wasn't about to give up now. He had built a life from nothing, and if he was going to be forgotten, then he would have to find a way to remember himself. He didn't need Jack's approval to keep going. What he needed was to rediscover the spark that had driven him all these years, the will to create, to make something of his life, to leave a legacy that would last beyond his years. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a soft orange glow over the nursing home's grounds, Scott picked up a pen and opened a notebook. He had always loved writing, even if it had never been his main focus. He had written letters to his wife, shared small poems with Jack when he was younger, but he had never truly told his story. Now, as he sat there, he realized that his life, his journey, was something worth telling. It wasn't just about the work he had done or the sacrifices he had made. It was about the lessons he had learned along the way, the wisdom he had gathered, the strength he had found within himself. He began to write, and in those words, Scott found not just his voice, but his purpose again. Scott's life had always been defined by hard work and sacrifice. He had spent decades building not just his career, but his family's future. Yet, in the quiet solitude of the nursing home, Scott realized that his greatest accomplishment, raising Jack, had become a painful reminder of what he had lost. His son, the one he had devoted his life to, had turned his back on him without a second thought. The conflict wasn't just the fact that Jack had placed him in the nursing home. It wasn't just about being abandoned in his final years by the very person he had given everything for. The real conflict ran deeper. It was about betrayal, a betrayal that cut to the core of who Scott was. It wasn't just a simple case of neglect. It felt like a complete erasure of everything he had worked for, a denial of his very existence. Jack had grown up under Scott's watchful eye, and Scott had always believed that, no matter how busy life got, family would remain a constant. He had worked long hours at the factory, often at the expense of his own health, to ensure that Jack would never go without. Scott had missed birthdays, anniversaries, and important moments, all for the sake of providing a future for his son. But now, that same son, the one he had fought so hard to provide for, was sending him away like an unwanted object. And what hurt most was that Jack didn't even seem to care. It was as if Scott had become a burden, a nuisance that Jack didn't have the time or emotional energy to deal with. Scott knew the reality of growing old. He had watched his parents age, saw them suffer in ways he couldn't have imagined, and made promises to himself that he would never end up like them. But the stark truth was now in front of him. Aging wasn't just about the body slowing down, it was about becoming invisible. As people get older, they begin to fade from the center of the story, pushed aside by the younger, more active generation. It was a harsh reality Scott hadn't fully understood until now, until Jack had placed him in the nursing home as though his father's worth had suddenly disappeared. He tried to tell himself it wasn't personal. Jack was busy with his own life. After all, he had a career, a family, and dreams of his own. Scott had always known that Jack would grow up to be independent, but he had never imagined that independence would come with such a cold, indifferent edge. Jack wasn't just neglecting his father's needs. He was abandoning him emotionally. The visits became less frequent, the phone calls fewer. What had once been a close father-son relationship now felt like a distant memory, a dream that had long since faded. Scott's mind raced, his heart aching with the weight of his new reality. He had always been a proud man, never one to ask for help, never one to rely on anyone other than himself. But now he was forced to confront the truth, that pride, that self-reliance had been part of the problem. His entire life had been focused on giving to others, to Jack in particular, but in the end, there was no one there to give to him. His entire identity had been built on being the provider, the strong one, the one people could rely on. But now, He was nothing more than an afterthought. The nurses, the staff, they were kind enough, but they weren't family. They didn't understand his pain. They didn't know the sacrifices he had made, the hours he had spent at work, the moments he had missed with his family. It wasn't their fault, of course. They had their own lives to live, their own stories to tell. But Scott couldn't shake the feeling that he had been reduced to a mere visitor in his own life. Each day felt like a reminder of his irrelevance. As he walked down the sterile halls of the nursing home, he would catch glimpses of families visiting their loved ones, laughing, holding hands, reminiscing about old times. But all Scott had were memories, fading memories of a time when his son had looked at him with pride, not with indifference. It was during these long, lonely days that Scott began to think, really think, about his life, about what he had achieved and what he had lost. He realized that his identity had been so intertwined with being a father, a provider, that he had forgotten about himself. He had sacrificed so much for others that he had never truly taken the time to live for himself. The truth hit him hard. He had spent so many years focused on Jack's future, on making sure that Jack never went without, that he had neglected his own dreams and desires. Scott had always put family first, but now, in the silence of a nursing home, he realized that maybe it was time to put himself first. He didn't know how, or even where to start, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't let this be the end of his story. Something inside Scott began to stir. It wasn't just anger or resentment. It was a spark, faint at first but undeniable. He could feel it growing, a quiet determination to rewrite the ending of his life. Maybe he had been forgotten by the one person he had trusted most, but he was not done yet. There was still time to make something of the rest of his life, to show Jack and the world that no one, no matter how old, should ever be written off. Days turned into weeks, and the isolation Scott felt in the nursing home only deepened. Each morning, the sun would shine through the sterile windows, casting long shadows across the room, but it never seemed to reach Scott. The walls were quiet, save for the occasional shuffle of footsteps or the soft murmur of conversation from down the hall. It was as if time had slowed down, with the rhythm of his life now defined by the ticking of the clock and the regular visits from the nurses. He tried to keep himself busy. He read books, tried his hand at puzzles, even took walks around the courtyard. But no matter how hard he tried to distract himself, the same painful truth lingered in his heart. Jack had left him here. His own flesh and blood had chosen convenience over compassion, practicality over love. The more Scott tried to push it from his mind, the more it festered inside him. It was hard not to feel invisible when everything around him, his room, the facility, and even his own life, seemed to scream of a man who had outlived his purpose. What hurt the most was that Jack didn't even seem to care. Scott had always been there for him, through every scrape, every disappointment, and every triumph. He had given his son everything, poured all his love and energy into raising him to be a man of character, to be strong and independent. But now, as the days passed, Scott couldn't help but wonder if any of it had mattered. Had Jack ever really understood the sacrifices Scott had made? Did he even appreciate the years of hard work, of being the father who worked long hours to ensure Jack could have the best education, the best life, even when it meant neglecting his own needs? It wasn't just that Jack had placed him in the nursing home. It wasn't just that Jack had abandoned him. What stung the most was that Scott had never been given the chance to prove himself worthy of love in his older years. There had been no heartfelt conversation, no tears or apologies, no acknowledgement of the years they had shared. Jack had simply decided that the best way forward was to take the easy route, to avoid the responsibility of caring for a father who was aging. Scott's mind often wandered back to memories of better times, moments he had cherished with Jack when he was younger. There was a time when Jack had played his first Little League game, and Scott had been there in the stands, cheering him on. He remembered Jack's graduation day, when he had proudly watched his son walk across the stage, all grown up and ready to take on the world. At that moment, Scott had felt like he had done his job as a father. He had given Jack the tools to succeed, and now Jack was on his own path, carving out a future for himself. But it wasn't supposed to end like this. Not like a forgotten relic. a burden to be discarded when his usefulness had passed. Scott's entire life had been spent building something for his family, something to leave behind, a legacy. But now, as he sat alone in the sterile, dimly lit room, he felt like that legacy was slipping away. What good was all his sacrifice if it meant nothing when he needed his son the most? The anger began to simmer beneath the surface. Scott had spent so many years suppressing his emotions, trying to maintain the strong, stoic exterior that had always been expected of him. He had never allowed himself the luxury of bitterness, always pushing through hardships with determination and grace. But now, it was impossible to ignore the hurt. How could Jack not see the pain he had caused? How could he so easily walk away from the man who had shaped him, who had given him everything? The days grew colder, the isolation more intense, and Scott's mind began to wander down darker paths. He couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal that gnawed at his soul. The nursing home, once a place of supposed comfort and care, felt like a prison. It wasn't just the physical space that confined him. It was the emotional walls, the sense that he was no longer part of the world he had once known. It felt as if everything had been taken from him. Jack had taken his presence, his purpose, his pride. But in the midst of this overwhelming sadness, something inside Scott began to stir. It wasn't just anger. It was the flicker of something else. The fire of self-worth that had been extinguished for so long was beginning to spark again. It wasn't too late for him to make something of his life. He wasn't ready to fade into the background, to be forgotten. He had always been a fighter, a man who never gave up, and this was no different. Scott's eyes narrowed as he thought of his son. If Jack thought he could simply walk away, if he thought he could discard him without a second thought, then he had another thing coming. Jack had made the mistake of underestimating him. It was time for Scott to show him that he was far from finished. There was still so much more to give, and he wasn't going to let this chapter of his life be defined by abandonment. The sting of betrayal was sharp, but it was also the catalyst for something greater. It was time for Scott to reclaim his life, to prove to himself, and to Jack, that age and circumstance would not define him. He was not done yet, and whatever it took, he would make sure that the legacy he had built would not be erased so easily. Days blended together in the sterile environment of the nursing home, each one feeling like a shadow of the last. Scott's body ached from years of hard work, and his mind grew restless with every passing hour. His once strong hands, which had built and repaired his home and family, now trembled with the weight of regret. His mind, too, seemed slow, clouded by the sharp sting of his son's betrayal. But amidst the despair, something inside Scott began to shift. As he sat by the window, watching the seasons change outside, Scott's thoughts wandered to the past. He remembered his younger self, full of hope and ambition, ready to tackle the world with nothing but grit and determination. He had always believed that hard work was the key to success, and for years, it had been his driving force. But now, as he stared out at the changing sky, he wondered if hard work had ever been enough. Was that all he was, just a provider, a worker, a man defined by what he could give rather than who he was? Was that why Jack had walked away so easily? The doubt that had settled in his chest gnawed at him. For so long, Scott had defined himself by his ability to provide for others. His worth was tied to the things he could do, the sacrifices he could make. But what was he now, when there was no one left to care for? What value did he have in a world that seemed to discard its elders so easily? The questions haunted him. But then, one afternoon, a moment of clarity pierced through the fog of his thoughts. Scott had been sitting in the common area of the nursing home, watching the other residents interact with their families, when something shifted inside him. He saw a woman, an elderly lady with glasses perched on the edge of her nose, smiling as her daughter held her hand. It was a simple moment, but it spoke volumes. The love, the connection, the respect, it was all there, clear as day. And then Scott realized he wasn't just a father. He wasn't just a man who had spent his life building a legacy. He was someone who had lived, who had experienced love, loss, and triumph. He was someone with stories to tell, wisdom to share. His value wasn't in what he had given to others. It was in who he had become, the life he had led, the lessons he had learned. And he wasn't about to let that be erased. It was time to stop focusing on what Jack had taken from him and start thinking about what he still had left. Scott realized that he wasn't a forgotten relic. He wasn't invisible, even if it sometimes felt that way. He had lived a life worth remembering, and he had a legacy that was far from finished. It wasn't just about the past, it was about the future. And Scott wasn't going to let his story end like this. The fire inside him, the spark of determination that had lain dormant for so long, began to burn brighter. The nursing home no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a new beginning. Scott knew he couldn't change the past, couldn't undo the hurt his son had caused, but he could change the way he moved forward. It was time to take control of his own narrative. He had lived his life for others. Now it was time to live for himself. He began writing. At first, it was just simple thoughts, fragments of his life, bits of wisdom, lessons he had learned along the way. But soon, it turned into something more. It turned into a story. His story. The story of a man who had dedicated his life to others, only to find himself abandoned in his final years. But it wasn't just a story of sorrow. It was a story of resilience, of finding strength in the face of adversity, of refusing to be forgotten. As he wrote, Scott began to see himself in a new light. He wasn't just a father who had been left behind. He was a man who had lived a full and meaningful life. He had overcome challenges, faced losses, and found ways to keep going when everything seemed impossible. He had built something, not just for himself, but for the people he loved. And while that love may have been taken for granted, it didn't change the fact that it was real, that it had meant something. The process of writing became cathartic. It was as if, with each word, Scott was reclaiming his voice. He wasn't just documenting his life. He was shaping it, defining it, making sure that no matter what happened, his story would be heard. And it wasn't just a story about betrayal and abandonment. It was a story of survival, of strength, of purpose. It was a reminder that no one, no matter their age, was ever truly finished. The more Scott wrote, the more he began to feel a shift in his emotions. The anger, the resentment, the feeling of being forgotten, it all started to fade. In its place, there was a quiet acceptance, a sense of peace. He had been through a lot, but he was still here, and that was enough. Scott didn't know what the future held, or if Jack would ever come back to apologize. But what he did know was this: he would not wait for anyone to define his worth. He had been forgotten by the one person he loved most, but he was determined to make sure that he would never forget himself. He would finish his story, and in doing so, reclaim the legacy he had built, not for anyone else, but for himself. It was late one evening when Scott had his moment of realization, a flash of clarity that cut through the fog of bitterness and sorrow that had surrounded him for so long. He had spent the day writing, his pen moving across the page as he poured his heart into his book, but the act of writing had become more than just an exercise. It was a way of reclaiming his sense of purpose, a way of proving to himself that he wasn't done yet. Scott sat at the small desk in his room, his tired eyes scanning the words he had written. He had come a long way from the lonely man who first entered the nursing home. The words on the page felt like his lifeline, like a bridge between the past and the future. But that evening, as he reread his story, something changed. He looked at the words he had written and realized that he had been holding on to anger for too long. His anger toward Jack, his resentment, his bitterness, it had been consuming him, poisoning his thoughts, and clouding his vision. It had become the lens through which he saw the world, and it was keeping him trapped in a cycle of hurt. Scott had spent so much of his life focusing on what Jack had taken from him that he hadn't realized what he still had. The most important thing, the one thing that couldn't be taken away, was his own sense of self-worth. For so long, Scott had defined his life through his role as a father. He had been there for Jack, giving everything he had to raise him, to provide for him, to ensure that his son had a better life than he did. And when Jack had placed him in the nursing home, it felt like all of that was erased, like the years of sacrifice, the hard work, the love had meant nothing. But the truth was, Scott had never been just a father. He had never been defined by his relationship to Jack alone. Scott's life had been full of experiences, full of moments that had shaped him into the man he was. He had worked tirelessly, built things, created a life from scratch, and found joy in the simple things: a garden, a good book, a quiet moment of reflection. And even now, even in this nursing home, there was so much left for him to discover. The truth hit him like a thunderclap. Jack's abandonment didn't define him. It wasn't a reflection of who he was or what he had done. It was a reflection of Jack's choices, not Scott's worth. Jack had chosen a path that led him away from his father, but that wasn't Scott's burden to bear. Scott had done the best he could with the life he had, and now it was time to let go of the anger and embrace what he still had left: the opportunity to live for himself, not for anyone else. The revelation was simple, but profound. Scott understood now that he didn't need Jack's approval to feel valuable. He didn't need anyone's validation. He was not a failure just because his son had abandoned him. He was not invisible, not forgotten. He was a man with a history, with stories to tell, with lessons to share. And those things mattered regardless of who recognized them. Scott stood up from his desk, his heart racing. He hadn't realized how much he had been holding on to until now. The anger, the feelings of betrayal, the sense of loss, it all began to loosen its grip on him. He wasn't going to let Jack's decisions hold him back any longer. He wasn't going to waste another moment letting someone else define his worth. Scott had his own story to tell, and it wasn't over yet. He walked to the window and looked out at the night sky. The stars were dimly visible through the haze of city lights, but they were still there, scattered across the heavens like tiny beacons of hope. It felt like the universe was reminding him that there was always something greater than the pain he had endured. Scott smiled for the first time in months. For the first time, he felt free. He no longer felt the weight of abandonment or betrayal. He had a life to live, a story to finish, and he would not let anyone or anything take that from him. He wasn't a man to be forgotten. He wasn't a man defined by the actions of others. He was Scott, father, builder, survivor, and he still had more to give. In that moment, Scott made a decision. He would finish his book, but it wouldn't just be a record of his life. It would be a testament to resilience, a message to everyone who had ever felt discarded or overlooked. He was going to tell the world that age didn't diminish your value, that your worth wasn't defined by the people who left you behind. The turning point wasn't just about letting go of the anger. It was about reclaiming his life, his dignity, and his future. For the first time in a long time, Scott felt truly alive. And as he stood there, looking out at the night, he realized that no matter what came next, he was ready for it. The world had not seen the last of him. It wasn't long after that revelation that Scott's life began to shift, though not in the way he expected. The pain of abandonment, the betrayal, and the quiet suffering still lingered in the back of his mind. But the fire he had rekindled inside himself, his will to live, to create, to leave a legacy, burned brighter with each passing day. Scott's book, the one that had started as a small outlet for his thoughts and memories, began to take shape in a way he hadn't anticipated. What began as a cathartic exercise had transformed into a powerful narrative of resilience, a story that spoke not just to the pain of being abandoned, but to the strength that can emerge from such hardship. Every chapter, every word he wrote, was a defiant cry against the helplessness he had felt when Jack first placed him in the nursing home. It was his refusal to let the world forget him. It was his declaration that he was still here, still fighting, still capable of making a mark on the world. He hadn't expected the book to be anything more than a personal endeavor, a way to validate his own existence. But when he finished writing the final chapter, something remarkable happened. He found himself at a crossroads. Was he content to simply keep this story to himself, a private reflection of his journey? Or was it time to share with others? In the stillness of his room, Scott stared at the finished manuscript on his desk. He could feel a surge of excitement, mixed with a deep sense of fear. The world outside the nursing home was so vast, so unforgiving, and his place in it had felt so small. Who would care about the life of a man who had been left behind? Who would want to read a story about someone who had been abandoned by his own son? But Scott realized that this was exactly why the story needed to be told. He wasn't writing for validation or fame. He wasn't writing to get back at Jack or to gain sympathy. He was writing to prove to himself that he was more than what others saw, more than just the elderly man left to wither away in a sterile room. His story, with all its pain and triumph, deserved to be heard. And if it could inspire even one person to rediscover their own strength, then it would be worth it. With trembling hands, Scott picked up the manuscript and made a decision. He would send it out. It was time to share his story with the world. Scott spent the next few days researching publishing options, sending out queries to publishers, and reaching out to anyone who might be interested in his story. His heart raced with each email, each phone call. He had no illusions about what might happen. He didn't expect to become a bestseller or to suddenly become famous. But what mattered was that he was taking a step forward, moving beyond the boundaries of the nursing home, beyond the confines of his past. It was during this time of waiting, when the days seemed to stretch on in uncertainty, that Scott's resolve was truly tested. He received rejection after rejection, the standard polite responses from agents and publishers who didn't think his story was marketable enough. They told him that it was a nice story, but not one they were interested in. For a brief moment, the familiar feeling of rejection, of being overlooked, crept back into his mind. But Scott refused to give in. He thought of the nights he had spent working in the factory, when the odds seemed insurmountable, and he had pushed through anyway. He thought of the sacrifices he had made for Jack, of the years he had spent building something for his family, only to be discarded. He realized that the rejection of his book was just another obstacle, just another hurdle he would have to overcome. It wasn't the end of his story. It was just another chapter. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Scott received an email that changed everything. It was from a small publishing house that had been intrigued by his story and wanted to offer him a chance to publish his book. They saw the value in what he had written. They saw the depth of his journey, the strength in his words, and they wanted to help him share it with the world. Scott's heart skipped a beat as he read the email. This was the moment he had been waiting for. His story was going to be shared, and it wasn't just going to be forgotten. He wasn't just another forgotten old man in a nursing home. He was someone whose life mattered, whose experiences were worth telling. But as the excitement began to wash over him, a sudden thought struck Scott. Jack! What would Jack think when he found out that Scott's book had been accepted for publication? Would he feel guilty? Would he feel proud? Or would he continue down the path of indifference that had led him to abandon his father in the first place? The thought lingered in Scott's mind, but he quickly dismissed it. It didn't matter anymore. Scott had done this for himself, not for Jack. He had reclaimed his voice, his life, his dignity. And if Jack ever came around to realize what he had lost, it would be too late. Scott had already won. The world would know his story, and that was more than he could have ever hoped for. He wasn't just a man who had been left behind. He was a man who had risen from the ashes, who had created something meaningful out of his pain. And now, his story would live on, far beyond the walls of the nursing home. The day Scott received the acceptance email was the day his life shifted permanently. The small publishing house had decided to move forward with his book, a decision that felt like a resurrection. For so long, he had believed he was invisible, overlooked by a world that had no place for someone like him. Now, the world would see him, not as an aging man left to rot in a nursing home, but as someone whose experiences, struggles, and wisdom could inspire others. But even as his excitement grew, a nagging feeling tugged at him. The first wave of joy was quickly replaced by doubt, a doubt that had shadowed his entire journey. Was this really the right thing to do? Was his story worth sharing? Or was it simply a way to prove something to Jack, to seek validation from a son who had abandoned him? Scott sat alone in his room, the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him. He had already started to write his book for himself, to regain control over a life that had felt so powerless for so long. But now, with the reality of publication closing in, the fear of rejection, of not being accepted by the world, resurfaced. Would anyone truly care? Would anyone understand the pain of a father who had been left behind? Or was it all just a desperate cry for attention, a futile attempt to prove to his son that he still mattered? The questions raged within him, but the answers came with the soft click of his email inbox. Another message. This time, it was from the publisher confirming the details for the next steps. It was official. Scott was going to be a published author. His book would be printed, and the world would have the chance to read his story. For a moment, Scott's mind went blank. He felt a sharp pang of fear, of vulnerability. This wasn't just about writing anymore. This was about exposing himself to the world, about standing up and saying, "This is who I am. This is what I've been through. This is my truth." He could no longer hide behind the comfort of anonymity. His words, his life, will be laid bare for anyone to see. And then, a wave of clarity swept over him. He thought of Jack. He thought of the countless sacrifices he had made for his son, of the love he had poured into raising him. He thought of how Jack had discarded him, as though his years of hard work and love were meaningless. But now, as Scott sat in the quiet of his room, he realized something profound. This wasn't for Jack. It wasn't for anyone else. This was for him. Scott had spent so much of his life living for others, putting their needs, their expectations above his own. He had lived for Jack, for his family, for the future he had wanted to give them. But now, in this moment, Scott understood that he had to live for himself. This book, this story, wasn't about revenge or seeking validation from his son. It was about embracing his own worth, about proving to himself that he still had a place in the world, that he wasn't defined by the actions of others. The phone call came shortly after from the publisher's representative. They spoke excitedly about the next steps, cover designs, marketing plans, release dates. It all seemed surreal to Scott, but he couldn't deny the excitement building within him. He wasn't just telling his story. He was changing the narrative of his life. As he hung up the phone, Scott felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: pride. Not pride for his son's achievements, not pride for the success he had built for others, but pride in himself. He had fought for so long to be seen, to be heard, to make a mark. And now, with his book set to be published, he finally was. It wasn't the way he had imagined his life would unfold, but it was real. This was his moment. His story was no longer confined to the pages of a notebook or the empty walls of a nursing home. It was going to be shared with the world. And if Jack or anyone else wanted to read it, they could. But Scott no longer needed their approval to feel worthy. The fear that had once paralyzed him faded away, replaced by a quiet, unshakable certainty. He wasn't defined by his son's rejection. He wasn't defined by the confines of a nursing home. He wasn't defined by the walls that others had built around him. Scott was defined by his resilience, his strength, and his ability to rise from the ashes of his own pain and create something meaningful. The day of the book's release arrived quickly, and Scott found himself holding a copy in his hands, the weight of it both physical and symbolic. The cover, a simple design, featured a photograph of a faded family portrait, the image of a man who had lived through years of sacrifice and heartache. He stared at the book for a moment, letting the reality settle in. This was it. This was his moment to shine, to be seen, to show the world who he truly was. But more than that, it was his moment to reclaim his own identity. It was time for Scott to write the final chapter of his life. Not as a forgotten man, not as someone who had been discarded, but as a man who had stood tall in the face of adversity and had chosen to live fully with purpose and pride. And as he looked at the book in his hands, Scott realized that the greatest victory wasn't in the pages of the book, nor in the success it might bring. The greatest victory was in knowing that he had found himself again, and that no one, not even Jack, could take that away from him. The weeks that followed the publication of Scott's book were a whirlwind of interviews, book signings, and speaking engagements. The response was overwhelming. People from all walks of life reached out to share their own stories of abandonment, of aging, and of rediscovering their own worth in the face of adversity. Scott had touched something in them, something raw and universal, a shared pain, but also a shared hope. The book had reached people he never could have imagined. What started as an intimate reflection of his own life had become a testament to resilience, a reminder that no one is ever truly invisible, no matter their age, their circumstances, or the mistakes of others. Scott's story was no longer confined to the pages of a book. It was alive, circulating among readers, finding its way into the hearts of people who, like him, had been forgotten, overlooked, or abandoned. The accolades, the praise, and the attention were gratifying, but for Scott, the true reward was not in the fame or the recognition. It was in the quiet peace that settled over him as he walked through the nursing home, a place that had once felt like a prison. Now, it felt like a mere chapter in a much larger story, one where Scott was not the helpless victim, but the author of his own fate. One day, as Scott sat in the small garden of the nursing home, the sun shining down on his face, he received an unexpected visit. Jack stood at the gate, his hands in his pockets, looking hesitant, almost nervous. For a moment, Scott's heart stopped. Was this the moment of reconciliation? Was Jack finally coming to apologize, to explain why he had left his father alone all those months ago? Scott's mind raced, but he remained calm. He had already found peace within himself, and he knew that no matter the outcome of this conversation, he had already done the work of healing. He had already discovered his worth. Jack was no longer the source of validation in his life. But still, he couldn't ignore the pang of hope that rose in him. Hope that maybe, just maybe, Jack had come to see him not just as a father, but as a person deserving of respect. "Dad," Jack began, his voice unsure. I've been reading your book. I didn't know." He paused, swallowing hard, as if struggling to find the right words. "I didn't know how much you had been through. I never realized how much you gave up for me." Scott looked at his son, the man who had abandoned him, the man who had forgotten him in his time of need, now stood in front of him, a mixture of regret and shame on his face. Scott didn't say anything right away. He simply sat back in his chair, taking in the moment. This was the first time Jack had truly seen him, not just as a father, but as a man who had lived, who had suffered, and who had overcome. "I didn't expect this from you, Jack," Scott finally said, his voice steady. "But I've learned something through all of this. I've learned that I don't need you to come back to me. I don't need your apology to feel whole. I've spent my life giving to others, and I've learned that my worth doesn't come from what others think of me. My worth comes from what I've made of my life, from the strength I've built within myself. I'm not defined by the things I've done for you, or by your decisions. I'm defined by what I've done for myself." Jack's eyes filled with tears, and Scott could see the weight of his regret. But Scott didn't offer him comfort, didn't tell him everything would be okay. He didn't need to. What mattered now was that Scott had come to a place of complete acceptance, both of himself and of the choices others had made. He had healed, not because Jack had finally shown up, but because he had stopped waiting for others to validate his existence. He had already found that validation within himself. "Dad, I'm sorry," Jack whispered, his voice breaking. "I was selfish. I was so caught up in my own life, I didn't even stop to think about what you needed. I know it doesn't make up for everything, but I want you to know how sorry I am." Scott nodded, his heart softening. "I know, Jack. I know." He paused for a moment before adding, "But you can't change the past. What matters is what you do now." There was a long silence between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a moment of understanding, a moment of closure. Jack had come back, and Scott had seen him for who he was, a man who had made mistakes, but who was trying to make things right. And Scott had seen himself for who he was, a man who had lived through pain, who had been abandoned, but who had risen above it all. As Jack sat beside him, Scott realized that, in the end, this was all he could ask for. Not an apology, not a dramatic reconciliation, but the simple acknowledgement that his life had mattered, that his story, his journey, was worth something. Scott's life was no longer defined by the wounds of the past, by the loss of his son, or the loneliness he had once felt. His life was defined by his resilience, by his ability to find purpose in the face of adversity, and by the wisdom he had gained along the way. And now, his story was not just his own. It belonged to anyone who had ever felt abandoned, forgotten, or overlooked. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the garden, Scott looked out at the horizon, a sense of peace filling him. He had finally found the strength to forgive, to let go, and to move forward. And with that, he knew that no matter what came next, he had already won. In the end, it wasn't about the book or the success it brought, or even Jack's return. It was about Scott's journey, a journey of self-discovery, healing, and growth. And that was the most powerful legacy of all. Scott's story is one of resilience, growth, and reclaiming one's own worth, no matter the challenges life throws your way. But now, it's your turn to reflect. Have you ever felt forgotten, abandoned, or lost in the shadows? How have you reclaimed your sense of self-worth in difficult times? If Scott's journey resonates with you, I want to hear your story. Share it in the comments below. Tell me how you've overcome hardship or rediscovered your strength in the face of adversity. Whether it's through family struggles, personal battles, or moments when you felt alone, your voice matters. And if you haven't yet, make sure to grab a copy of Scott's book. It's more than just a story. It's a testament to the power of perseverance, the importance of self-love, and the strength we all have inside to rise above life's challenges. You can find a link in the description below. If you found value in Scott's journey and want to be inspired by more stories like his, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an inspiring story that might just change the way you look at your own life. Remember, no matter what you're going through, it's never too late to change your story. You have the power to rise, reclaim your voice, and create a legacy that's truly yours. Keep fighting, keep growing, and keep sharing your story. Thank you for being part of this journey. I can't wait to hear from you in the comments. Stay strong, stay inspired, and I'll see you in the next video.